Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Come on in, find a seat. Hello, I'm Jacquie Malloy, and welcome to today's All Access webinar, a conversation about suicide and ageing. As we begin today's session, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands we're gathering. You can hold them in your mind, or you might like to write them in the chat. Today, I'm coming to you on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the spiritual strength and resilience of Australia's First Peoples and their deep and enduring connection to country, the land, the sky, and the water and the animals who live there. Today, our special guest is Jill Gray, a bereavement counsellor with her own practice offering grief and loss counselling and education, spiritual care and supervision to individuals and workplaces. Jill has a very diverse working background spanning nursing, healthcare quality management, occupational health and safety, spiritual care, supervision and counselling. I would just like to say too at the start of this, if you're here, you know the topic is suicide and ageing, but just like to invite you to remember to take good care of self while we're having this conversation. So welcome, Jill.
Thank you.
Jill,
Thanks, Jacquie.
one of the ways we like to start these discussions is with a definition of what we are discussing. And it might sound simplistic, but I'm sure there are nuances to suicide, the act of suicide, and even the word suicide that we don't always stop to consider. Could you give us a bit of a definition of the world that we're in today?
Yeah, certainly. Look, suicide is incredibly complex. It's often a very stigmatized topic. And for that reason, we often don't talk about it. And so today I really welcome that opportunity and for people attending to have that and engage in that conversation. It's an interplay of many issues, and there's a couple of definitions that I actually tend to use in my practice and in my workplaces. And one is a World Health Organization definition, and it speaks of suicide as the act of, and excuse me if I read it, the act of deliberately ending one's life. And in some cases, it can be difficult to ascertain whether that was intentional or not. And there's a second definition that I also use because it speaks to the complexity and some of the causes, and there's never or seldom a single cause. And that is that suicide's a reaction to overwhelming feelings of loneliness, worthlessness, helplessness, hopelessness, and depression. And it occurs when a person's emotional pain exceeds their ability to cope. So that speaks into, there's a whole heap of factors, complex factors that lead a person to either contemplate suicide or to suicide.
Thanks for giving us that. This sense of overwhelming feelings, how common is it for older people to take their life? How common is it for older people to feel that overwhelm, that extreme overwhelm?
It's an interesting question because how common is it for older people to feel extreme overwhelm also taps into what's the expectations of older people.
Yeah.
That sense of you've been around for a while, you can cope. You've experienced loss before, so you may cope. But equally, it is quite common. Suicide in the general population, there were about 3,200 suicides in 2022. So that's about 9 per day. And I'm talking general population here, not necessarily just the aged. So it's a reasonable small proportion of all deaths, a bit under 2%. But it's also the 15th leading cause of death in the general population. So it's up there in the top 20 of those causes of death. In numbers of that 3,200, yes, the ageing population is small, but in age-specific suicide rates, so the numbers in a certain age group, some of those numbers are quite high, and certainly the graphs for males and females over 85 have shot up markedly in that age-specific suicide rate. So, again, 2022, there were about 35 females and about 70-something males. And males traditionally, general or in ageing, tend to have an increased rate of suicide about 3 times that of females.
When you say general or in ageing, you're talking about someone in residential aged care and someone who might be at home? Is that?
In the general population, I was talking.
Oh, sorry.
From about 8 years of age to over 85, that 3,200. But certainly in residential aged care, there was a study came out a few years ago around, and it was for the period of about 10 years. And it spoke of, for that period of 10 years, about 140 people suiciding in aged care facilities. So that's about 10 a year, 9 or 10 a year. So suicides do occur in aged care, and there's been some more recent data out around people who are waiting for aged care packages. I don't have the exact numbers, but there are increased numbers of people who are waiting for aged care packages who are suiciding.
That is thinking about people within residential aged care taking their own life, particularly when there's some agency that they no longer have. It's kind of ironic that they have the last possible agency. Yeah.
And it is that challenge of those numbers I mentioned in aged care. About 50% of those people had been in aged care for less than a year. So it speaks to admission, it speaks to processes within aged care, and there's still a lot of research to be done around why. But the fact that that's occurring, and the fact that often it's underestimated, the numbers, perhaps gives us reason to sit up and go, how can we work with this? What can I do? And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about some of those what can I do's a little bit later.
Just still in residential aged care, can we just touch on and clarify the difference between voluntary assisted dying and suicide?
Yeah. Suicide, I'll hark back to those definitions that I mentioned earlier. It's intentional. It's not always intentional to end one's life. That's not always the case, but the action does result in death. VAD, voluntary assisted dying, is a process. And it's a process of somebody choosing medical assistance to aid their dying. And that process is entered into by conversations. Initially, it may be with family, initially with a general practitioner. And it's that process of then going, hear the person and progress them through that process, allowing them the choice of entering in or stepping away. And there's different rules in different states about who can access voluntary assisted dying. And I would imagine that we're all sort of quite aware of what those rules may be. But you've got to be an adult. You've got to have decision-making capacity. And your terminal illness has got to have some time frames around it, and that is also different in different states. But VAD can also be administered by the individual once they've gone through the process and it's been approved. The individual can administer, or it can be physician administered, doctor administered. So I like to think of, at a very simple level, voluntary assisted dying is not aligning with suicide, because the individual doesn't want to die. They're already in a stage of terminal illness when they're seeking VAD, but they want to control how and when they die. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. It's a very interesting it's a very interesting tension around life and loss. And I guess I'm coming back to that original definition around overwhelm, and how, you mentioned as well when you were talking about that, the expectations that we have as a community around what older people can bear, and that there is a certain expectation that either they're better at dealing with loss, or that because loss should be expected, that somehow it's easier. Do you think that that is one of the reasons why this feels so invisible?
Look, absolutely. I think there's an invisibility often associated with aging, and I say that as a person with silver hair that meets that aging criteria, and that sense of invisibility, that sense of, as you mentioned, expected. These things have happened. You should have coped. You've lost somebody before. You've dealt with change before, but people, as they age, those impacts are cumulative. Those senses of loss, those challenges are actually quite cumulative. So yes, they help us cope, but they accumulate over time. And when perhaps within society we feel we have less of a voice, that invisibility, then as we speak out, we may not be heard, or we may not be able to access the means, the GP, the family, be listened to. And that's where certainly, working within aged care facilities, that ability to increase knowledge of how to have conversations, of encouraging conversations with people so that they can speak to those losses.
We did a series, as you know, on grief, loss, and trauma. And one of the things that we talked about was disenfranchised grief. That sense of that you don't have the right to feel this
Yeah.
is it's overwhelming just to be talking about it, honestly, let alone feel it. And I wonder what can we drill down to, especially because there's such a significant difference between men and women that you pointed out. Was it 70?
Generally, men suicide
Yeah,
at 3 times the rate of women.
3 times the rate. So what are the psychosocial factors that are influencing these decisions?
There's seldom one would be my key point. Like I said earlier, it is absolutely multifactorial. When you think about people moving into aged care, they are at increased risk. If they're from a marginalised population, they're also at increased risk.
Yeah.
If they're a male, they're at increased risk. So there's those general risk factors, but there's also that recognition of the individual continuing to lose abilities as they age, the fear associated with that. So their limitation of activities is a risk factor if people are becoming more frail, opening up the conversations with them, really listening to what they're saying. If somebody has lost somebody that's in their key support network, I tend to use and prefer to use the word family rather than family, because our key supporters are not always family. So if somebody in that support network has been lost recently, that's quite a solid risk factor. And if there's been a previous history of self-harm, it's worth considering. And self-harm can be, perhaps silent sometimes. Was the fall a fall? Was a certain activity an intent or just an event? So again, speaking into that need to have conversations, to have intentional conversations with people. Certainly also in the generalised population, mood disorders, alcohol and other drug use can be risk factors as well, relationship breakdowns. So you add those into those specific ageing population risk factors. It's worth having the conversations. It's worth learning how to have those conversations.
If you could, I'm just thinking, you've said this, before, that the conversations matter, and that presumably there are conversations to be had before suicide ideation, as well as an intervention. If you could establish a solution, what would it look like? What would you like to see in, well, particularly in residential aged care, given the rates that we're hearing, but just in the community in general?
Look, for me, and I've worked in the suicide field for a little while now, and I particularly work in I work in the grief and loss side, but I also have a role in postvention, so in engaging with families and workplaces and others after a suicide loss. So, for me, it's about opening up the space for conversation, which then leads to education. Because if you and your staff are feeling able to talk about things, to engage in the conversation, you're also likely to then increase your level of confidence in engaging in conversations. In the prevention space, very much around picking up a conversation from somebody that may say, I'm just over this. I'm done. And being brave enough and having the skills to go. Sometimes when people say that, they're thinking of suicide. Are you thinking of that? And though that sounds very forward, it's actually the conversation that can be life-giving, literally, because people often want permission. If they're thinking, you are not going to encourage them by asking that question, but you're actually giving them permission to talk to you. And if you don't feel comfortable, that's okay. You simply need to say, hey, look, person, I can't engage in this conversation right now, but perhaps if I get a colleague, a manager or whatever. But with confidence comes competence and the ability to hear those subtle things that people might say. And then you can engage in that conversation. You can then tap into resources for that individual, but equally there are resources out there. Conversations like today is one of them that can help you to gain more skills, and some of them are online, take half an hour of your time. Others are a few hours of your time, and there's 2-day courses all around in the prevention space, how to engage in the conversation. What do I say?
I think it's like I mean, this is spiritual care, isn't it? That what we're talking about in terms of having conversations, and it's following that same pattern of recognize, respond, refer. I feel like this is 5 years ago, we were having this kind of conversation like we're having today around death and dying, and we're getting better and better in that space. And this feels like the next space to come through. I've just noticed, let me just see here. Yeah, Michael's just said, I feel more comfortable asking if a person is thinking about taking their own life rather than using the word suicide. And there's also, I feel the word suicide has a taboo attached to it. I think that's right. Jill very kindly pointed me towards a resource, and we'll put this link in the email that goes out with the recording. You may have noticed some of the language that Jill and I have been using today, and it's quite intentional language. For example, there's a preference to not talk about committing suicide, that committing can be associating suicide with a crime or with a sin. And so rather we talk about taking their own life, took their own life. So I think there's a lot for us to learn to be able to be comfortable with having conversations. But at the very heart of it, there's got to be this feeling of being a good human, which we say is the basis of spiritual care, right? It's how do you be a good human to someone?
Yeah, and that sense of the essence for spiritual care is also being empowering people, connecting them with themselves and others, transcending things, and certainly it's engaging in conversations that you can empower people that you're working with. That is giving good spiritual care whilst you're undertaking your work. So absolutely, there are resources out there to support your confidence in doing that. And you get to choose how to engage. But as I said, having the conversation, whether it's in the prevention space or after somebody's suicided, actually asking somebody how they're going, not being afraid to ask about the person that has been lost to suicide. Actually empowers somebody to talk about their feelings.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I can only imagine that there would be people that if they were given the opportunity to be seen and heard, that a weight would lift. It wouldn't necessarily resolve everything, but you know, there is truth to the old saying, a problem shared is a problem halved. There is truth to it.
And certainly I could only say in my practice and in working with colleagues, that ability to be able to open up that space for sharing that problem, the permission giving, the sense of relief that comes from somebody being able to talk about what they're feeling.
Yeah.
Is massive, and it makes it very meaningful work when you can do that.
Very meaningful. We only have a few minutes left, but I'm just interested to know if anyone's got any comments or questions that they'd like to ask. If you do, please come off mute or raise your hand, whatever you're most comfortable with on Zoom, as we are. We will put some resources in the email that is sent out to you with the recording. If anyone has got any specific requests, please do feel free to get in touch. Qualities such as, I'm just reading from the chat, qualities such as active listening, empathy, patience, and calm understanding, showing you really care about the person is essential. Yes, indeed. And as it was said, active listening when they do respond is so important. Really listening, using empathy and silence is okay. Silence is okay. Exactly. Being present doesn't always require words. We've had people say that before in the past, that they've had astonishing conversations literally by sitting with someone and holding their hand where it was appropriate and allowing them to just be and to feel comfortable to share what they had to share. I always feel uncomfortable asking question 16 in the Cornell. Oh, hang on. Which is, in the last week, has X, she or he, said that life isn't worth living or that she would rather be dead. Yeah. That's quite confronting, isn't it?
And I think that taps into what you said, and I see in my work, is improving. We are a fairly death-denying society. And when we work in aged care, it confronts us that we all will die. So the ability to actually work with that reality and to ask that question, again, it comes back to the sense of being listened to and heard, and that sometimes, yes, happens in silence, but it also happens in asking the question and feeling comfortable, because you might sometimes be surprised what happens when you open up that space for somebody.
And I think that's the perfect note to end our conversation on, because we do have only 30 seconds left. But Jill, can I thank you again on behalf of all of us for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. It's been so good to have you here today. And I think we've just got started really in talking about this, and let's talk about it more.
Sounds like a good plan. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, it is a big topic for 30 minutes. You're right. And so we will do something like this again with Jill. That would be fantastic. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, everybody.